Hell didn't arrive with tanks, bombs, or artillery. It arrived in silence, on a single morning when German officers walked into a village and decided that beauty itself was a threat to the Reich. Women who had never held a rifle, who had never spoken a word of defiance, suddenly found themselves treated as enemies of the state. Their crime wasn't espionage, sabotage, or treason. Their crime was existing with faces the regime considered dangerously desirable. And on that day, every rule of human decency evaporated. Soldiers who believed they were defending a nation transformed into predators, enforcing a twisted doctrine where appearance dictated fate. There were no warnings, no trials, no appeals. It was a bureaucratic descent into madness, an operational directive carried out with chilling precision. By nightfall, innocence had been outlawed, and femininity itself had become a battlefield. Stay sharp, because what happens next is not for the faint of heart. Before we dive into the brutal machinery that turned ordinary women into state-defined enemies, I need something from you. Look around. Where are you watching this right now? Is it a quiet living room? A busy office? Maybe you're in your car during a break from work. Tell me the name of your city in the comments. I want to know exactly where these stories of forgotten courage are echoing today. And while you're there, press that like button if this opening already hit you harder than you expected. Trust me, what you've seen so far is just the ignition spark. The real detonation is still ahead. If you think you're prepared for what a government can do when ideology becomes more powerful than morality, you might want to reconsider. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and brace yourself. This isn't just history. This is a warning carved into the bones of an entire generation. Ready? Because we're not going back. We're going deeper. It began like a routine inspection, the kind that villagers had grown accustomed to after years under Nazi rule. But this time, the officers didn't check ration cards, radios, or political pamphlets. They carried folders, thick, beige, stamped with the black eagle of the Reich, and inside those folders were lists of names. Not political dissidents, not saboteurs. Women, young, old, married, single. It didn't matter. What they shared wasn't ideology, but appearance. These lists had been compiled by regional authorities who believed certain traits: blue eyes, symmetrical facial structure, particular bone proportions, posed a threat. A threat of what? Of being noticed, of distracting soldiers, of weakening discipline. Beauty, according to the warped calculus of the regime, was a liability that could compromise military focus. And in a war defined by paranoia, any liability could be classified as treason. The officers moved through the village like executioners disguised as bureaucrats. Their boots sank into mud still wet from the night's rain, their breath steaming in the cold morning air. They pointed, they called out names, they demanded identification papers. Mothers stepped forward, trembling. Daughters hid behind fences. No one understood the charge, not yet. But confusion has a sound, and the village was drowning in it. Doors slammed, dogs barked, shutters cracked open. Silence followed every order barked by those polished black boots. What the locals didn't know was that this operation was part of a much larger program. While Germany battled enemies on every front, another war brewed within its borders, a war against anything that threatened ideological purity. And in this twisted hierarchy, a woman's face could be deemed more dangerous than a stolen weapon. If her presence made soldiers forget their duty, she was classified as a destabilizer. If her features didn't match the state's vision of idealized femininity, she was considered defective. The cruelty was methodical. By noon, the women named on the lists were corralled into a makeshift holding yard by the town church. Soldiers had erected wooden barriers reinforced with steel brackets, the kind used to secure supply crates on transport trains. The smell of wet hay mixed with diesel fuel drifted through the air. A truck rumbled nearby, an Opel Blitz, standard Wehrmacht logistics vehicle, capable of carrying 2.5 tons of cargo or 40 human beings, forced shoulder to shoulder. The engine idled like a predator waiting to feed, Inside the enclosure, panic metastasized. Some women wept, others stared defiantly. A few refused to speak at all. One young girl, no more than 17, clutched the silver locket her father had given her before he was sent to the Eastern Front. When a soldier demanded she remove it, she shook her head. He slapped her so hard she fell into the mud. Nobody helped her, not because they didn't want to, but because helping meant joining her on the ground. Orders soon followed. No explanations, no legal statements, just commands. Each woman was photographed, front, profile, full body. A Leica 3C camera was used, the same model German war correspondents carried into battle. Its mechanical shutter clicked, documenting fear frame by frame. The photographs weren't souvenirs. They were evidence. Evidence of what? According to the files, they were proof of risk factors. Even now, historians struggle to quantify what that term meant. But one thing was undeniable. These women were no longer citizens. They were classified assets, biological variables that needed containment. The first truck filled quickly. The rear doors slammed shut, chains locked. No one knew where it would go, but rumors had been circulating for months. Whispers of camps where identities vanished, where the state remade women into something compliant, something stripped of pride. Or worse, rumors that beauty was not just criminalized, it was erased. Engines revved, dust lifted, mothers screamed their daughters' names. The convoy rolled forward, turning the village road into a one-way passage toward oblivion. And as the trucks disappeared beyond the tree line, one truth settled like ash in the hearts of those left behind. In this place, under this flag, a woman's face was no longer her own. It was a weapon. And weapons, once identified, were never allowed to remain free. The road north wound through dense forest, a narrow artery of cracked asphalt bordered by pine trees that seemed to lean inward, as if nature itself wanted to hide what was happening. The Opel Blitz trucks bounced violently over potholes, and every jolt sent the women inside crashing into one another. The interior smelled of fear, sharp, metallic, impossible to ignore. A single lantern swayed from a hook, casting shadows across their faces like bars of a prison cell. No one spoke. Not because they had nothing to say, but because every breath felt rationed, every word potentially punishable. Hours later, the convoy reached its destination. Barbed wire glinted under floodlights that hummed like angry insects. Guard towers loomed above, their MG-34 machine guns mounted and ready, with belts of 7.92 57mm Mauser rounds coiled like serpents. A sign at the gate bore no name, only a number. It wasn't a place meant to be known. It was a place meant to erase. The gates opened with a metallic groan. Soldiers barked orders and yanked women out of the trucks. The mud outside was thick and cold, swallowing their shoes, pulling at their ankles like it wanted to claim them. The women were lined up by height, by hair color, by skin tone. It was organization disguised as madness, efficiency weaponized into cruelty. Clipboards appeared, and the sorting began. The first building they were forced into resembled a medical clinic, white-walled and sterile. But its purpose was nothing close to healing. Inside, rows of examination tables stood beneath hanging lamps that buzzed harshly. Medical personnel, men and women in pristine uniforms, moved with the mechanical detachment of factory workers. They measured bone structure with calipers, recorded hip-to-shoulder ratios, inspected jawlines, cheekbones, hair follicles. Beauty wasn't a gift here. It was a variable, a flaw, a threat. One officer, a tall man with silver-rimmed spectacles, walked down the line like he was selecting livestock. His voice was calm, almost bored, yet every gesture carried absolute authority. A woman with long blonde hair and unusually clear blue eyes drew his attention. He tilted her chin upward with a gloved finger, examined her pupils, then raised his hand. 2 guards stepped forward and dragged her away. No explanation, no destination. Just gone. Another woman, a brunette with freckles, stood trembling when her turn came. The officer paused, scrutinized her face, then scribbled something indecipherable on his clipboard. She wasn't dragged away. Instead, she was ordered into a different line. The message was clear. Some would be taken, others would be processed, but none would leave unchanged. Further down the hall, a second phase of classification unfolded. Women deemed disruptive assets, the term used in their files, were led toward a chamber with steel doors and thick glass observation windows. Behind those doors, screams sometimes leaked through the vents, then stopped abruptly. Rumor suggested that whatever happened inside wasn't punishment, it was modification. To the regime, beauty was not merely dangerous. It was malleable. If it could not be controlled, it could be dismantled. Meanwhile, outside, floodlights illuminated long barracks separated by electrified fences. Uniforms hung from laundry lines. The smell of chemicals drifted in the air. This was no prison. Prisons had sentences. This was a system, a machinery of transformation. The women were not captives. They were specimens. As night fell, the guards changed shifts. Boots stomped in rhythm. Dogs patrolled the perimeter, their teeth bared, their training precise. The camp didn't sleep. It observed. It calculated. Every woman here had been removed from her world not because she posed a tactical threat, but because the regime couldn't risk soldiers thinking of anything other than the war. A smile, a glance, a tilt of the head. That was enough to disrupt the militarized hive mind. Somewhere, deep within the complex, an alarm sounded. Short, sharp, procedural. More trucks were arriving, more faces, more lives. The convoy never stopped. There was always another village, another list, another woman whose very existence challenged the control of a state that saw emotion as weakness, desire as treason, and beauty as a crime. In this place, the war wasn't fought with rifles or bombs. It was fought with identity. And the first casualties weren't soldiers. They were the women who dared, without ever knowing it, to be seen. Dawn broke over the compound with a kind of indifferent brutality. Fog clung to the ground, and the air tasted like iron. The women were jolted awake by whistles and rifle butts slammed against the barracks' tin walls. Sleep, for those who found it at all, had been shallow, haunted by the knowledge that this place operated on logic no human heart could understand. They were herded into a courtyard, where a long steel structure dominated the center. It resembled a warehouse, but its reinforced doors and barred skylights suggested something far more sinister. The guards ordered the women to file inside, 2 by 2, like livestock being funneled toward slaughter. As they stepped through the threshold, a blast of cold, antiseptic air hit them. The room was lined with metal chairs bolted to the floor, each equipped with leather restraints on the wrists, ankles, and forehead. At the front stood a machine unlike anything most of them had ever seen, an apparatus of polished steel, gears, and wires connected to a humming control console. It was roughly 6 feet tall, with segmented arms that pivoted and rotated along mechanical joints. A nurse, or what passed for one, adjusted dials on the console. The machine responded with a low whir, like a beast waking from hibernation. This wasn't execution. It wasn't punishment. It was calibration. One by one, the women were strapped into chairs. The machine extended a slender probe, tipped with a needle so fine it looked like a strand of hair. The nurse pressed a lever. A hiss filled the room as a syringe, no larger than a fountain pen, delivered a clear solution directly beneath the skin. The injection wasn't painful, but the sensation that followed was unnatural. A spreading numbness, like the body had suddenly forgotten a piece of itself. The guards monitored their reactions, timing each tremor, each heartbeat spike. Clipboards filled with notes. Observations turned into numbers. The women weren't people. They were variables in an experiment no one consented to. After the injections, the women were forced into a second chamber, dimly lit and lined with mirrors. The reflections staring back were familiar, but subtly distorted. Their skin seemed paler, their eyes appeared wider, their lips fuller. The alterations weren't dramatic, but unmistakable, like someone had nudged their features toward some predetermined ideal. Beauty wasn't being erased, it was being standardized. This was the core of the regime's madness. They believed beauty, if left unchecked, could fracture discipline. But beauty that was engineered, regulated, and approved, that could be weaponized. A controlled distraction was a strategic asset. A wild one was treason. Whispers rippled through the chamber. Some women sobbed quietly. Others stared hard at their reflections, refusing to blink, as if memorizing their original faces before they vanished forever. A few clenched their fists, fury simmering under their skin. Each response was catalogued. Emotional resistance was data. Compliance was currency. Later, the women were marched outside to a training yard bordered by scaffolding and half-constructed barracks. Soldiers stood in formation, watching them with calculated detachment. A commanding officer stepped forward, his uniform immaculate, his voice sharp enough to cut through silence. He didn't talk about crimes or guilt. He talked about duty, about how beauty could serve the fatherland, how a face could inspire obedience, manipulate morale, destabilize morale in enemy ranks. It was a manifesto disguised as instruction. Their identities were assets. Their features were tools. Not a single weapon was visible, yet every word felt like a gun pressed against the soul. By midday, the injections began to take full effect. Some women fainted. Others gritted their teeth, muscles trembling under invisible pressure. Whatever was in those syringes wasn't just cosmetic. It was psychological. Memories blurred. Emotions flattened. Fear dulled into something else. Not acceptance, but vacancy. A woman who could feel nothing could obey anything. The camp wasn't erasing beauty. It was forging it into a weapon, even if the weapon never learned it had been sharpened. And the worst part? The transformation had only just begun. By the second week, the compound had shifted from a holding site into a full-scale indoctrination factory. The women no longer moved freely. They were marched in rigid columns, their steps synchronized by whistles, their bodies conditioned to obey without thought. The injections continued, small doses now, administered in the neck, in the temple, along the spine. Whatever the serum contained, it reacted with their nervous systems, tightening emotional responses like screws. Fear didn't vanish. It calcified into submission. Meals were rationed, dark bread, boiled cabbage, watery broth. Not enough to starve, but just enough to dull resistance. Hunger made minds pliable. Sleep deprivation made wills brittle. Every variable was calculated. The state didn't want corpses, it wanted conduits. The women were divided into units and relocated to specialized halls. Each hall had a different purpose. One was filled with mannequins and mirrors. Another, long corridors with red stage lights illuminating platforms. A third hall had projectors playing propaganda reels on a loop. These weren't classrooms. They were laboratories of influence. In Hall A, women were coached on posture, gait, and presence. Officers dissected every movement, identifying which gestures triggered attraction, attention, or obedience. A single tilt of the head could be corrected with a barked command. A misplaced smile earned a slap. They were being rewired into symbols, not individuals. Hall B was worse. Here, soldiers observed from behind a mesh wall, taking notes as the women stood on platforms, forced to maintain eye contact for minutes at a time. Every flicker, every blink, was documented. The state wanted to quantify allure. Desire had become a measurable resource, its metrics inked on documents sealed with official stamps. The propaganda hall, however, was the final layer. Films projected on trembling screens glorified the regime's values. Captions scrolled beneath images of disciplined soldiers, obedient citizens, triumphant parades. A narrator's voice drilled ideology straight into their subconscious. Emotion is disorder. Identity is chaos. Beauty must serve purpose. The message repeated until it fused with their thoughts. But indoctrination wasn't enough. The regime wanted proof the transformations worked. That proof came in the form of tests. Soldiers entered the halls, stone-faced, trained to ignore distraction. The women were ordered to walk, speak, gesture according to exact instructions. If a soldier's focus broke, even for a heartbeat, the woman responsible was dragged away. No one ever saw them again. Failure meant removal. Success meant further refinement. One woman, Anna, became a focal point for the guards. Not because she sought attention, but because she resisted invisibly. No matter how many injections she received, how many hours she was forced to stand beneath propaganda reels, something in her gaze remained intact. She carried a memory, a sense of self the serum couldn't dissolve. During an examination, she was instructed to maintain eye contact with a lieutenant for 60 seconds. The room fell silent. A stopwatch ticked. The lieutenant's jaw tightened. Anna didn't smile. She didn't flinch. She simply existed, unbroken, unpossessed. At second 42, he looked away. A ripple of whispers followed. The lieutenant barked orders, furious with himself, but the damage was done. The officers took her away. She didn't scream. The compound's lights flickered that night. Power surged, then died, plunging the camp into darkness. For a terrifying moment, the only sound was breathing, staggered, anxious, human. Then generators roared to life and spotlights snapped on, illuminating every face, every defect, every failure. Whatever they were building here wasn't finished. It wasn't even close. The regime believed war wasn't won with bullets. War was won by shaping minds, bending wills, weaponizing identity. These women were no longer prisoners. They were prototypes. And somewhere, buried within blueprints no one dared speak aloud, the next phase had been scheduled. It wasn't transformation anymore. It was deployment. Deployment didn't mean release. It meant relocation, an extraction into the shadows of cities already suffocating under wartime paranoia. Trucks arrived at dawn, engines rattling, exhaust fumes mixing with morning frost. The women were issued uniforms unlike anything the regular army wore. Charcoal gray coats tailored to accentuate posture, insignias embroidered not with rank, but with symbols no one outside the program could decipher. They looked military, but they didn't belong to any recognized branch of the Wehrmacht. They were ghosts manufactured by policy. Each woman received a dossier sealed with wax. Inside was a photograph, her own face staring back, catalogued like a piece of evidence, along with coded instructions. Their missions varied. Some were transported to garrisons on the Western Front. Others infiltrated administrative centers. A select few were assigned positions near high-ranking officers. They weren't being deployed to fight with weapons. They were being deployed to fight with influence. One destination stood out. Berlin, the beating heart of the Reich. Its avenues were choked with propaganda banners, its nights crackling with anti-aircraft fire, its citizens drowning in fear, hunger, and rumor. Into this environment, the women were inserted like chemical agents, silent, reactive, unpredictable. Their presence created ripples. Guards stiffened when they passed. Officers hesitated when issuing orders. Soldiers, hardened by combat and frostbite and artillery barrages, found themselves momentarily disarmed by a glance, an expression, a symmetry of features engineered to fracture focus. It wasn't seduction, it was destabilization. The state had weaponized the intangible. Anna, whose resistance had unsettled even the lieutenant, was assigned to the capital's war ministry complex. The building was a fortress of concrete and steel, guarded by flak towers armed with 128mm cannons, capable of hurling explosive shells over 10 kilometers. Inside, corridors echoed with boots and clipped commands. Paperwork moved faster than bullets. Secrets lived in filing cabinets. Anna was stationed near a logistics division, ostensibly as a clerk. But her role had little to do with typewriters and everything to do with observation. She saw officers argue over troop shortages, overheard whispers of failed offensives, traced maps pinned to walls where front lines receded inch by inch. The Reich wasn't invincible. It was bleeding. What the program hadn't anticipated was that injecting identity with chemicals didn't eliminate conscience. It buried it. And conscience has a way of clawing back through the cracks. The serum dulled emotion, but it hadn't erased Anna's memory of the village, of the screams, of the moment beauty was declared contraband. Her indoctrination had taught her one phrase: beauty must serve. But now, standing at the epicenter of a crumbling empire, she questioned one word: serve whom? Night after night, she lingered near document rooms where classified files were stored. Guards trusted her presence. She was invisible by design. But invisibility is the perfect camouflage for rebellion. She watched, listened, and waited. Meanwhile, other women in the program, stationed across the country, were producing unintended effects. Commanders snapped at subordinates. Soldiers lost concentration during drills. Arguments erupted over nothing. Battles were planned hastily, disastrously. The program designed to enforce control was corroding it from within. Beauty, once criminalized, had become an infection, one the regime couldn't contain. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some said the women were blessed. Others claimed they were cursed. A few whispered that they weren't women at all, but constructs, illusions crafted by the state. Fear metastasized faster than artillery shells could silence it. The program's architects sensed something slipping beyond their grasp. They summoned reports, interrogated officers, recalibrated procedures. But it was too late. They had treated human beings like variables, forgetting that variables change. The deployment wasn't strengthening the Reich. It was destabilizing the very foundation it was built on. A storm was forming, not outside the borders, but inside the bloodstream of the nation itself. And Anna, whether she intended to or not, was about to become its lightning strike. The storm broke on a night when Berlin's sky was already bruised by distant explosions. Allied bombers rumbled overhead, Lancasters and flying fortresses, each carrying payloads designed for annihilation. A single B-17 could haul up to 8,000 pounds of bombs, and tonight dozens of them carved burning scars across the darkness. Sirens wailed, searchlights swept the sky, anti-aircraft guns thundered from concrete towers. It was chaos layered upon chaos, the perfect cover. Inside the ministry complex, Anna moved like a shadow. She had waited weeks for this moment, long enough to understand routines, guard rotations, and vulnerabilities. Tonight, she wasn't following orders. She was violating them. Her pulse raced, but her face remained expressionless. Training had taught her that composure was the ultimate disguise. She approached the restricted archive room, its steel door protected by a mechanical lock and a single sentry. The man barely glanced at her. She was part of the scenery, another silent figure among countless others. She offered a carefully measured nod, eyes empty, emotion erased. The sentry stepped aside. Inside, shelves rose like tombstones. Documents, maps, and directives filled rows of drawers. But Anna wasn't looking for troop movements. She was looking for proof. The paper skeleton of the program that had turned her life into a weapon. After minutes that felt like hours, she found it. A folder stamped with the insignia she wore on her coat. Code name, Helix. She flipped through the pages. Chemical formulas, psychological conditioning methods, field test reports, lists of villages, lists of names, her name. Then she saw something else, something the architects had never intended for her eyes. Projected expansion. Dozens of camps. thousands of women. New serum variants. Plans to export the program beyond the borders of the Reich. If the war dragged on, beauty wouldn't just be weaponized, it would be industrialized. A tremor pulsed through her chest, not fear, not anger, but something deeper. A spark the serum hadn't extinguished. She tore the folder from the drawer and slipped it under her coat. A guard's footsteps echoed outside. No time to think, only to move. The hallway vibrated as bombs detonated miles away, shockwaves rattling windows. Lights flickered. The building groaned like a dying beast. Anna blended into a stream of officers rushing toward bunkers, her stolen dossier pressed against her ribs like a second heartbeat. Outside, the night was no safer. The city was burning. Fires illuminated rooftops. Smoke curled upward, catching embers like dying stars. Anti-aircraft tracers clawed at the sky, their red streaks painting the air with desperation. Anna moved toward a transport truck parked near a side gate. Chaos was her ally. No one questioned her. She climbed into the back among crates of ammunition and sealed herself inside. Moments later, the engine roared and the truck lurched forward. As Berlin shrank behind her, she opened the folder again, memorizing details before flames, bullets, or fate could steal them away. She wasn't escaping for herself. She was escaping with evidence. Evidence that beauty had been turned into a prison. Evidence that identity had become a battlefield. Sunrise found the truck rolling across broken countryside. Smoke still lingered on the horizon. Anna didn't know where she was headed, only that she was no longer part of the machine. She had become a fracture in it. One fracture can split concrete. One truth can topple pillars. One woman, stripped of agency and transformed against her will, had become the regime's most dangerous enemy. Not because she was beautiful, but because she remembered who she was before beauty became a crime. And as long as memory survives, no empire, no matter how brutal, no matter how armored, can ever truly sleep. History often records battles with tanks, artillery, aircraft, and the men who wielded them. But some wars are waged in shadows, without rifles, without trenches, without front lines. This was one of them. A conflict where identity became ammunition, where appearance became evidence, and where women were transformed into instruments of fear. Yet, even in a system engineered to crush individuality, something endured. Not armor, not artillery, memory. And it's memory, fragile, intangible, ungovernable, that outlives every empire. The same way steel warships rust, the same way bomb casings crack, the same way propaganda posters fade. The truth remains. The heroes of this story were never soldiers mounted on tanks, or pilots flying machines loaded with thousands of pounds of explosives. The heroes were the ones who refused to disappear, whose minds could not be rewritten, whose existence remained a rebellion. To them, and to every soul who resisted annihilation in silence, we offer our thanks. Their courage didn't end the war, but it ensured the war would never be forgotten.